Now that we've talked about the different types of animals in the Yellowstone ecosystem, I want to follow that up talking about animal behavior. And animal behavior is important because we can't really understand the interactions between different animals unless we get out in the field and study their behavior. So one aspect of this is ethology. Ethology is the study of animal behavior with an emphasis on the behavioral patterns that occur in the natural environments. And as we consider not just ethology, but behavior in general, a lot of time there's this nature versus nurture dynamic which is proposed. And the idea is how much of behavior is genetically programmed, and then how much of behavior is due to learning or environmental influences on the brain. And in many cases, especially when we talk about vertebrates and a lot of the larger animals that we've talked about, it's probably not an either or, it's a combination of the two. What is the role of genetics, and then what is the role of the environment in terms of behavior? But typically there are genetic constraints on how much learning and the types of learning that can take place. So one general category of behavior would be instinctual behavior. So instinctual behaviors are largely genetic. So in other words, you're born with certain programming, you're born with certain wiring, and that wiring will lead to specific behaviors. And instinctual behavior is triggered by very specific stimuli. So it could be auditory stimuli, visual stimuli, smells, it could be a lot of different things. And these specific stimuli will trigger specific behaviors. And generally speaking, then, instinctual behavior, because of these factors, really does not involve learning. So in other words, you're born with the genes that give you certain programming, and then that leads to specific behaviors. So they're not learned behaviors. So when we look at instinctual behaviors, then there's usually some kind of a stimulus we call assigned stimulus. And this can be a very specific type of stimulus, and I'll come back to that in a second. The stimulus then triggers a series of impulses that go through nerve cells that we call neurons, and you can think of it like electrical wiring in effect. So in other words, it will work along existing pathways, and that's known as an IRM, or an innate releasing mechanism. So that IRM is a reference to the actual pathway, and then this pathway then will result in a very specific behavior, which we call an FAP, which stands for a fixed action pattern. So for example, during breeding season, a male robin, when presented with another male robin, they'll attack each other. And so you could say that the male robin is assigned stimulus, but it can actually be much more refined than that. You literally can take a red feather and present it to a male robin, and it will attack that red feather. So learning then is different from that. Learning is not just instinctually based behaviors or genetically programmed behaviors. It's the process of developing a behavioral response based on experience. And so this leads to changes in the brain based on environmental encounters. So there are many types of learning. One type of learning is known as conditioning or associative learning. And in conditioning, it's a learned behavioral response to a novel or substituted stimulus, and we'll look at some examples of that in just a second. And another characteristic of conditioning is that it uses reward as a basis for learning. So there are two types of conditioning: classical conditioning, which is a passive type of conditioning, and operant conditioning, which I'll get to in a second. So in classical conditioning, the characteristics are that a stimulus is substituted for one that is already associated with a particular behavior. The animal learns to associate the new stimulus for the previously existing stimulus, and so they learn to associate that new stimulus with the reward. It's passive in that the animal doesn't really have to do anything to get the reward. The reward follows the stimulus rather than the behavior. And maybe the classic example of classical conditioning would be with Pavlov's dogs. Pavlov was a behaviorist, and what he had noticed is that when dogs were presented with their food, you may have noticed it as well, is that dogs will salivate. And so they'll start licking their chops kind of thing. And so what he initially did was presented a light with the food, and he did that over and over again, to the point where he eventually was able to just present the light, and the dog would salivate in response to the light. He also did it with a bell. So he rang a bell with the food, rang a bell with the food, rang a bell with the food, and then when he rang the bell, the dogs would salivate as well. So this is classical conditioning, substituting one stimulus for another. And how much this occurs in nature is a little hard to say, but certainly the next type of conditioning is something which I think is a big part of nature. And when we look at conditioning, and I'll talk about this again later, we can look at either conditioning being generalized or discriminating. Generalized conditioning is where you will respond to a lot of related stimuli. So in this particular example, if the dog was responding to any color light, that would be generalized conditioning. If it was only responding to a specific color of light, that would be discriminating. Or perhaps a specific tone of the bell would be discriminating, or many different tones of bell would be generalized. Operant conditioning is an active type of conditioning, and this is, a major type of conditioning which occurs in nature. In operant conditioning, the animal must perform an act or a behavior in response to a stimulus to get the reward. So the reward follows the behavior rather than the stimulus. And it's an active process, and the animal must do something to get the reward. So again, this is a major type of learning in nature. When you look at, say, grizzlies, for example, they feed on a lot of different things, and the young will learn from the mother. They follow the mother around, and the reward is food. So with bears, any kind of a food reward, they will learn from that. And they may associate the food with specific types of ecosystems at certain times of the year. But if they can learn, for example, to scare a hiker, the hiker drops his backpack and runs or goes up a tree, and there's food in that backpack, then what they have just learned is that if they scare hikers, they may get a food reward from that. And then they'll do that over and over again. And unfortunately for bears, anytime that they're encountering people and scaring people and taking their food, eventually they're going to die from that. And we'll talk more about that later. All right, so as we look at other types of learning then, so conditioning then would be a major type of learning of animals in nature. Another type is habituation. Now, habituation is where you just become accustomed to stimuli and learn not to react to certain stimuli, or at least the animal does. And this is really common in newborns. So when you see newborn elk or deer, even in domesticated animals like horses, I don't know if you've ever seen them, or cows. But the newborns, when they start walking, a lot of times they'll respond to all these different stimuli, visual stimuli, touch and so on. So they may be walking, and there'll be grasses that are hitting their legs, and they'll jump from one side and jump to the other, and they're spooky. They react to everything. And you can't live like that. You can't live for very long like that. So by observing the mother being calm and so on, they eventually learn that they don't have to react to all these stimuli. And so the reward basically is that you can relax. You don't have to be scared all the time, and then eventually they'll learn what to react to and what not to react to. But habituation is learning not to react to stimuli as opposed to learning to react to stimuli. Latent learning is more or less an unconscious type of learning, or learning in the absence of an obvious reward. So we can look at this in an example, say in a lab setting. Let's say you have two mazes, and in one of those mazes, let's say you put a mouse in that maze every day for an hour. Maybe you do that for a week or 2 weeks or for a month. And then at the end of whatever period you're working with, you take a mouse that's never been introduced to a maze, you put that in an identical maze, and then place a food reward in the maze. And what will happen is that the mouse that has experience in the maze will find that food reward first. So here's a situation where one mouse has just been allowed to wander around in the maze. There was no particular reward to that, yet it did learn about the maze. And so again, we refer to that as latent learning. So as animals wander their habitats, they learn about the habitat, even though there may not be any obvious reward. And this can be significant, for example, in capture release. When you capture animals, tag them, and then release them, it's very important to release them where you pick them up from, especially with small mammals. And you'll see a very distinct difference in behavior when you release animals to a new area as opposed to an area that they're familiar with. When you release an animal to an area that it's familiar with, sometimes it will stick its head out of the trap or whatever you have it in, look around a little bit, but boom, it's gone. It will just take off. It immediately knows where to go for shelter and so on. Where if you introduce an animal to an area where it wasn't previously, it'll come out, it'll look around, it'll take a few steps, look again, and it just kind of moves off slowly in a haphazard direction. And the mortality is going to be much, much higher in releasing animals to new habitats as opposed to releasing animals where you got them from. Imprinting is a type of learning that occurs and it's tied to specific stages of development. We see this in a lot of the waterfowl. Basically, when they hatch out, the first thing they see moving, that's mom. That's who they'll follow. So hopefully it is mom, and hopefully it's not a predator or a leaf blowing by or something like that. But generally, the first thing they see moving, that's what they follow. So they associate that with their parenting. Also, learning can be tied into, say, puberty of an animal. With birds, for example, they'll learn the song that they need to use for attracting mates at their puberty. If they don't learn it then, they'll never learn it. So they can't learn it before their puberty, they can't learn it after their puberty, they need to learn it at that specific time. So learning tied to specific stages of development is imprinting. And then insight learning is higher learning. This is where you can solve problems in your mind without doing trial and error. So trial and error in your mind, or take learning from previous situations and apply it to new situations. We generally consider insight learning to be the realm of primates, higher primates at that, maybe a few other animals, but we are seeing some instances of insight learning in other animals. I talked previously about, say, the Clark's nutcracker and other members of the crow family. They can practice deception, so that's not necessarily an instinctual thing. That's probably learned. That's a higher intelligence. So it may not just be the domain of humans and our close relatives. And behaviorists are taking kind of a fresh look at that concept of insight learning. Now, learning is tied to memory. There's a relationship there. And when we look at what memory is about and how memory works, a lot of this traces back to, again, behavioral studies and lab situations. And so let's kind of look at a possibility here. So let's say you have a mouse in a cage, and let's say you've got a box with a hole in it. Now, mice will instinctively want to go in that hole for shelter. And so what you can do is condition them not to go in the hole. So in other words, when the mouse approaches the hole, and a lot of this work was done in the last century, like the 1930s and so, but they would deliver a mild shock to the mouse, and it would begin to associate the shock with the hole, and after a while they'd realize, don't go in the hole. So that would be the learning, the conditioning that would take place. And then what was done, I'm not saying it's a good idea, but then what was done is an electroconvulsive shock was delivered to the mouse, basically knocking it unconscious. And when the mouse revived, there were really two things that could happen here. Sometimes the mouse would try to go back in the hole. Sometimes the mouse would remember and know not to go back in the hole. And the main difference was how soon after learning the electroconvulsive shock was delivered. If the electroconvulsive shock was delivered in the first hour after the conditioning had taken place, the mouse would forget and it would try to go back in the hole. If you waited 2 hours or more, it would remember, don't go back in the hole. So something was happening in that hour to transfer the memory from what was called, or at least the model that was developed, transferring the information from a short-term memory to a long-term memory that was a permanent memory. So that's still the basic model for learning then. We think that there are, as we get information, that there are these short-term memory stores, STM, standing for short-term memory, that will use existing circuitry in the brain. And so the information, as it goes through these circuits, existing circuits, that is a memory. And I can't really go into the details, and we don't really know, to be honest with you, how passing impulses from nerve cell to nerve cell generate our consciousness and memory and all that, but that is the reality. And then at some point, if there's enough stimulus and repetition and so on, that information can be transferred to other parts of the brain that we call long-term memory or long-term memory stores. And there, new associations between nerve cells will be generated. In other words, the brain literally, physically will change. And so new circuitry will be established in the long-term memory stores. And we refer to those as an engram. So short-term memory does not produce an engram. It has these so-called reverberating circuits. So impulses will go through existing circuitry. And then when the material is sent to the long-term memory stores, we call that consolidation. So if consolidation takes place, new nerve cell associations take place in the long-term memory. That forms a new physical change in the brain. We call that an engram, and we consider that to be a permanent change, a relatively permanent change. Now, if you have interference with consolidation, if there's not enough consolidation, if there's not enough stimulus, repetition, and so on, we may not get that information into the long-term memory stores. And if the engram does not form, then there is no long-term memory. And so what happens is that the neurotransmitters deplete in these short-term memory stores, and when those impulses stop, then that memory is gone, basically. And so ways that you can improve the likelihood that information goes into long-term memory stores would be repetition. involving multiple senses, because we actually will store the same memory in different parts of the brain. So there may be an auditory portion of a memory, a visual portion of a memory, maybe smell is associated with it. So involve as many senses as possible. And then also if emotions are attached to it. Again, if you've ever been in an accident, those that have been in combat and so on, there are memories that are literally just, quote unquote, burned into your brain. They're hard to forget. So anything that's attached to emotion like that also is reinforced. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we store a lot of information, but the difficulty is retrieving the information. And all of us that have been students and taken tests know what that's about. So repetition, involving multiple senses, and again, if you can establish some emotional attachment, that makes it easier to not only store, but retrieve. Okay, so as we look at animals then, there are a number of so-called universal behaviors. Now, not all animals will exhibit these behaviors, but I want to go through a lot of the common behaviors we see in animals. One of these, of course, would be foraging. Animals feed, and they will feed on a variety of different things. Some of that is instinctually based, but a lot of that is learned. So some animals we describe as being specialists. The specialists, again, many times are driven primarily by instinct. Black-footed ferret likes prairie dogs. That's what it likes to eat. That's its primary food. That's pre-programmed. Now, how to hunt and so on is what they would learn over time from their parents. Generalists, like the grizzly bear, will eat a variety of different things, and so that involves less of pre-programming instinctually and more learning. And so as we've talked about in the life cycle of bears, both black and grizzly bears, they will spend at least 2 full summers with the mother and winters, learning what she does, where she goes, what she feeds on, sometimes a 3rd summer as well, to be honest with you. And so a lot of learning goes on there. And so they have to then take what they've learned and apply it to new situations when she drives them out of her territory. So again, forage would be a very, very common behavior. Everything has to eat. Communication. Animals communicate. They communicate in a variety of different ways. And when they communicate, what kinds of things are they communicating? One would be their emotional state, whether they're tense, whether they're scared, whether they're angry, whether they're sexually receptive. Also, identity can be part of the vocalizations that go on here. That is a part of the imprinting that sometimes goes on early on. And other types of information can be communicated as well. So one way that animals communicate is visually. Coloration of animals can help in recognition of species and so on, and actually of individuals as well. So that's one aspect. Posture certainly can be part of this. We'll be talking about aggression later, but when you look at animals and animals getting aggressive, we do the same thing. They try to look big. They try to take the higher ground. And that's what everything does, whether it's a bird, whether it's a bison, whether it's an elk, whether it's a human being. You want a piece of me kind of thing. We get big. We try to look scary. And so animals do the same kind of thing. Again, a meek posture, turning away, would be a submissive kind of posture. Rolling over, exposing the belly is a submissive kind of posture. And so that's one of the fun things to do when you're looking at wolves, is all the complex behaviors that go on there. Aggressive postures, submissive postures, and so on. Movement. How animals move can also tell you a lot about their emotional state. Stiff and so on. It means that they're irritated, swishing tails, bobbing heads. All of that can give clues as to whether they're irritated, relaxed, or not. And then in some animals like us, expression can be a factor. We don't really, I think, see that too much in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but as far as humans go, we convey a lot of information through expressions. Now, another way to communicate is through sound. And so there are a lot of animals that communicate vocally in the ecosystem. You hear all kinds of sounds in the ecosystem. A couple of examples that we were able to tape last summer. Certainly coyotes would be an example of this. We hear coyotes and wolves both constantly vocalizing within the ecosystem. And this little coyote here is communicating with this female at her den. And she was howling back, and you'll notice that he has a collar on, and that's because he was being aggressive with some campers in the area, and they wanted to find out what he was doing. Elk, we hear elk throughout the ecosystem as well. The cows will whistle. You can hear her whistling, you hear her grunting, snorting. And the bulls will do the same kind of thing, but the bulls, especially in the fall, you just hear these incredible bugles that they'll be letting loose, and you can hear those, literally for miles in some parts of the ecosystem. And that's as they get aggressive and they're trying to let all the other males know, hey, I'm in town, get out of my way. Bison would be another example of this. When we go up there early in the summer, it's usually pretty quiet. So you'll have a herd of cows with their calves, and there's a little bit of communication, vocalization going on, but not a lot. But it really becomes more noticeable later in the summer as the bulls start to come in and form their harems. And then the bulls will start communicating with one another, and they let out these bellows, and so it's just cacophonous. These bulls are just constantly bellowing to one another and letting each other know where they are and that they're trying to pick out females and so on, and it's really gets crazy. So anyway, and all of us end up imitating them constantly, so I won't do that now, but it's pretty funny to see these bulls snorting and bellowing at one another. Also, birds would be communicating. Again, they can convey sexual state. They can try to catch their mates or attract mates through vocalizations. Coloration can also play with that, but vocalizations as well. Chemicals are another way that animals communicate. Pheromones would be chemicals that are released into the air that have an effect on the behavior of another animal, basically hormones that get into the air. And one of the real interesting examples of this in the Yellowstone ecosystem involves the moose. So when a cow moose goes into estrus, from her pudenda, she'll be releasing chemicals, letting males know that she is coming into season, that she's going to be receptive. And this will bring in the bulls. And so the bulls will begin to shadow the females, where she goes, he goes, and so on, and he's waiting for her to become fully receptive. When he feels she is fully receptive, then he urinates, and in his urine is a chemical that when she inhales, it triggers her to ovulate. So she's affecting his behavior by drawing him in. He affects her behavior by actually triggering an unconscious ovulation, and that way when he does copulate, he has the best chance of fertilizing that egg. And then, of course, as part of that, smell is a part of that communication as well. So animals are constantly marking territory. So we'll see bears marking their trees. They have glands on their back too. They'll rub up against a tree with their back. Otters, any animal you want to name, basically they'll mark their territory with chemicals, and they're just letting other animals know that this is part of their territory. And so that's a very powerful way of communicating. And a lot of times I've heard animals described as seeing the world with their nose. They see with smell the way that we see with vision, and I think that's probably a pretty good description. Aggression is also a big part of behavior in the ecosystem and something we have to really be careful of. And so this aggression can be intraspecific aggression, and that means within the same species. And so intraspecific aggressions usually are territorial, animals fighting over territory for mating rights. Also, this can be for forage, for the food. We also see examples of interspecific aggression as well. But an example, something that we were able to tape in terms of intraspecific aggression involves some black bears that we saw in the ecosystem last year. And so these are actually both black bears. This is a large male black bear, and I'm pretty confident this is a female, and he'd been shadowing her for quite a while. He was trying to gauge her receptivity, and you can see that, hey, she doesn't like it too much. And I don't know if you noticed, she was chomping her teeth together too, and so that was a warning to him. And he finally got too close, and guess what? She's not ready to mate. So anyway, but that's real typical in the mating seasons. Males start shadowing females. They'll let them know whether they're ready or not, but that would be an example of intraspecific aggression. Now, aggression can also go between species, interspecific aggression, and so the most common example would be through predation, the food chains. But also, you can actually have interspecific territorial behavior. A lot of times that's over forage, obviously not for breeding rights, but over forage, certainly. And sometimes we don't really know what it's about, to be honest with you. And last summer, again, we were really lucky to tape kind of an interesting encounter between bison, some bull bison, some bachelors. And I've mentioned before that for my money, they're the most dangerous animals in the ecosystem because they do get territorial for almost no reason, and they're just kind of odd in that. They'll see us on the trail and just want to move us out of an area, but they see other animals too. I've seen them harass antelope and other animals as well. And so there was 3 bachelors here, and I'm going to show you in a second, of bison, also a grizzly bear that had stolen a carcass from some wolves. And so the wolves and the bison, and excuse me, the wolves and the grizzly had been kind of jousting over this carcass. And then eventually these 3 bison started to wander in. So I'll have you take a look at, part of what we were able to see. And so, here's the wolves over here, here's the bison, and then here's the grizzly bear over here on this side. And so the grizzly's got a carcass there. The bison had moved in. They were starting to be aggressive with the grizzly, and then they've moved back over to the wolves. And they're kind of slow moving. They're just trying to musher everybody out of the way. And at this point, they were kind of confused. They were kind of going back and forth. They weren't really sure who they wanted to harass the most. And eventually, they worked their way back over to that grizzly and tried to move him off that carcass. And I really thought they were going to move him out of the way. But he reared up on his rear legs, and then the bison scattered. So the grizzly actually won that encounter. And actually, I was putting my money on the bison. So anyway, but it was really interesting to see. But that's just the way the bison are, especially those bachelors. And as I mentioned before, you have to be careful when you're hiking out in this area, because herds of bison can move in behind you, and then you're going to have to make large detours around those herds, especially if it involves males, and especially as you get later in the summer, as they get more aggressive, you've just got to make detours around them because they're too big, too fast, too dangerous to take chances with. Territorial behaviors, again, a lot of times involve aggression, so there's a relationship there. Some animals hibernate or undergo periods of dormancy. Certainly not all animals do this, but many in the ecosystem do. So hibernation is where the metabolism slows down, and this is associated with winter. So chipmunks, for example, would be a classic example of this. Their body temperature actually gets down to virtually freezing levels in the winter, but they are able to survive. The trees will undergo periods of dormancy, but a lot of animals can slow down their metabolism. It may not technically be hibernation, but they can lower their metabolism at certain times. And then also a related term would be estivation. And estivation is where animals slow down their metabolism in the day due to heat. So it may be too hot for them in the day, and so they'll actually slow down the metabolism so that they don't overheat in the day. So that's not so typical in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but we certainly see that in desert ecosystems. So these are some of the behaviors we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and I'll finish this out in a supplement to this module. See you next time.